Les damos la bienvenida a una nueva edición de Congreso Futuro 2025. Estamos aquí en TV Senado justo con las entrevistas a los expositores que están aquí en Chile visitándonos para traer no solamente conocimiento, sino también divulgación. Queremos conversar con ellos en profundidad y poder entender mejor también lo que nos traen. Congreso Futuro 2025, esta es la 14ª edición y estamos también analizando un tema muy humano después de un año full con la inteligencia artificial. Nos preguntamos qué humanidad queremos ser. Y el día de hoy me acompaña aquí en el estudio Elizabeth Brannon, quien es profesora de psicología de la Universidad de Pensilvania y neurocientífica. Así que vamos a estar conversando sobre los detalles y sobre cómo se genera el pensamiento en los niños. Elizabeth, it's a pleasure to have you here in Congreso Futuro, and I'm glad to take this conversation with you.
It's been wonderful to be here. I've really been enjoying my time.
Yeah, great to hear that. As a neuroscientist, I mean, you study how the brain develops, specifically how the concept of number. I would like to drive this conversation. How can we understand how we start knowing things in our brains since we are childs?
Yes. So we're fascinated by the question of how the brain develops with the kind of normal input that the child receives in a lifetime, and how we build what is one of the most complex kinds of thinking, our mathematical abilities. So humans are capable of so much mathematically, and the question is kind of how the brain comes to be capable of such a thing, because obviously infants are not able to perform complex calculations, and yet it's actually the same brain systems that infants are using when they do very simple things like perceive quantity.
Yeah, that's true, and a lot of people actually don't like math, especially when they get older. Mm-hmm. So, in a sense, everyone performs calculations every day. Mm-hmm. We work with numbers, which is a very abstract concept. How we earn or how we get this knowledge since we're babies. And well, I will ask a few more questions later.
But, the early primitive number sense doesn't require any kind of education. It just occurs spontaneously. So without any education or number words or symbols or any kind of really specific input, babies will show evidence very early of this primitive number sense. So what do I mean by that? What I mean is that they can look at arrays, images, and perceive the rough quantity in an image. So a baby's not going to be able to differentiate 99 from 98 dots, right?
Sure.
But they will be able to tell the difference between, let's say, 6 and 12 dots, where the ratio is favorable and they're quite different numerically. So babies don't need any kind of education for this. This is something that occurs spontaneously and naturally in our development.
Yeah, that's very funny, because if you offer 3 chocolates or 1, they always will pick the larger number of chocolates.
Yeah, so you're getting at a really important point, though, that in terms of things like caloric intake, if we're looking at an animal in the wild, they should be kind of have evolved to optimize caloric input, right? They should want the more chocolate or more nuts or more fruit. And that's not always the larger numerical value, right? It could be more continuous stuff, more stuff, greater amount of stuff, and not the greater number of food items, for example. So there's been an assumption in the field that when looking at the animal mind or the baby mind, that they're probably not really paying attention to number. It just looks like number. That really what they're paying attention to is the amount of stuff. And so we have to do a lot to take that apart and figure out whether it's really number or amount of stuff that they're attending to.
You get immediately to a point I really wanted to address, because if we think 2 small apples is very different from a big apple or a watermelon, maybe, right? So we can choose less quantity but more amount of things. Mm-hmm. So again, we are humans and our brain develops up to, 20 something years. Mm-hmm. We are growing up. What's the case with the animals? Because some studies are conducted in babies and others you can compare a baby with some other animals. How does it work in order to find these concepts of number or quantity or amounts of things?
How does it work with animals?
Yeah. How do you compare, basically,
how does it
between
compare?
babies that cannot read
Yeah.
or write or talk?
Yeah, the challenge as a comparative psychologist who studies many animal species or a developmental psychologist, it's very challenging to compare species, even within the non-human animal kingdom. But it's even harder to compare infants, children, and animals because of the problem of the modality of how we get them to respond. So babies are very helpless compared to monkeys. When we engage with monkeys in these kinds of experiments, we can do thousands of trials. We can use touch screens and get them to make explicit responses. In contrast with a baby, you only have them for a few minutes before they're totally uninterested in behaving for you. And we have to use completely different measures of their knowledge or interest. So it's very hard to compare in a quantitative way, to say that maybe a monkey is equivalent to a 3-year-old child or something like that. It's very difficult to make those kind of comparisons. But what we do see is that the same signatures apply in their primitive number sense. So when babies are given various tasks, I can tell you about the kinds of ways we measure this with babies, and when monkeys are given the same kinds of tasks using a different experimental apparatus, but still asking the same questions, we see that it's the ratio in all cases that controls discrimination, and we see that the representations are really abstract. So both babies and monkeys, for example, can appreciate that 3 sounds and 3 sights are equivalent.
Oh.
So very abstract in terms of cross-modal representations.
That's actually quite interesting. I didn't.
Yeah.
I wasn't waiting that answer. So you mentioned you give them different tasks. I would like to ask you about the task in just one more second, because I would like to. How do you measure? Because you cannot plug a baby or a monkey. That would be kind of unethical, maybe. How do you get all the signals? How do you interpret? Because sometimes you're just observing them, or maybe just explaining the task will be better to get the knowledge out of them.
Right. So by the time a child is 3, we can use the same kind of experimental tasks that we use with monkeys, with touch screens and getting explicit responses from them. But before that, in infancy, we have to use completely different methods. So we make use of the fact that babies like to look at novel things. You probably, if you've interacted with a baby and held a rattle in front of them, they get bored pretty quickly, but you have to grab another one from the diaper bag and rattle it in front of them to keep them interested, right? So they lose interest pretty quickly. They like novel things. Babies also like to see changing things. So if you rapidly change pictures, they're going to be interested in that compared to if it's just staying static, right? And they also like to look at surprising things like magic shows. So we make use of all of those natural tendencies in infants and design experiments that ask, okay, so if I show a baby images that all share the same number, so 8 dots, another 8 dots, another 8 dots, they'll vary in different ways. So the dots will have different locations on the picture, different sizes, but they're always 8. The baby will get bored after a while, and then we can show them a new picture of 8, or a new picture of 16, for example. And if they look longer at 16 than 8, even though both images are new, that tells us that they actually can differentiate 8 and 16. So that's an example of what we call the habituation paradigm, because babies get habituated, bored of something, and then they show a novelty response. But we have a lot of different methods like that to ask about infants in the first year of life.
That's actually very interesting, and it's related to a question I wanted to make about. We usually have this number or quantities and space-related stuff. Are those areas of the brain connected in some way, or is it totally different?
Yeah, so there's a lot of interest in the representation of time, number, and space, and that question has been asked in many different ways, both in terms of the neural basis and behaviorally. Can we kind of learn, does information we learn from one of those domains help with another domain, for example? And they do seem to be very related. They rely on some distinct brain areas, but the intraparietal sulcus is important for all three of those types of representations. And in fact, there's a lot of behavioral work with children showing that all sorts of spatial games are very helpful for the development of mathematics. So playing with Lego or learning all sorts of shapes and even language about space is very helpful for mathematics.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking. I mean, like time, space, and number is something that you use or you see babies. I have a 8-year-old kid, but he was a baby a few years ago, and I was experiencing with these kind of things, and it's very interesting how they, well, first get bored, but also how they develop this. Oh, I should grab these and shape or put together some shapes that are similar size or form.
Right.
Is that it has to be related in some way with the concept of the after concept of number.
I mean, they're definitely distinct in some ways and related in others. We've done studies with infants at 6 months of age, for example, to ask about their representation of number, time, and space. And we see that it's the same ratio, a 1-to-2 ratio, that's important with all three of those domains at 6 months of age. So a 6-month-old baby, if you show them a shape, for example, repeatedly, and then double it in size or halve it in size, the baby will notice the difference. But if you just do a 2-to-3 ratio, a smaller difference, they won't notice the difference. So, and it's the commonality is interesting, that it's the same ratio that's important in infancy for number, time, and space.
That's very interesting. I would like to come back to this and ask you a few more questions about how can we use this in the future when they grow and how this evolve in time. But I need to go to a small break because we need to go to a pause. So volvemos en unos minutos más. Estamos conversando con Elizabeth Brannon, quien es psicóloga y profesora de psicología en la Universidad de Pensilvania. Estamos recordándoles que estamos en el Centro de Extensión del Instituto Nacional, aquí en Congreso Futuro 2025, con la pregunta de ¿qué humanidad queremos ser? Nos vemos en unos minutos. Estamos de regreso en esta conversación junto a Elizabeth Brannon, profesora de psicología de la Universidad de Pensilvania, en Congreso Futuro 2025 aquí en TV Senado. Recordarles que pueden también ver sus charlas en todas las plataformas de TV Senado y también en congresoFuturo.cl. Elizabeth, we were discussing on neuroscience, especially on babies and how they get the concept of number, how it's developed, and how it can we study from in monkeys, comparing in infants, in 3 years old and all that. I would like to know a little bit more on how you get to know this. I mean, the tasks you assign them or how it works, the work of a neuroscientist or a behavioral neuroscientist.
Yeah. So it might seem funny, like why do we care about monkeys and how they represent number and what they can do with their primitive number sense. But we're interested in this question because we want to understand what kinds of thought is possible without language, right? So how does language transform thought as the child learns number words, for example? And so by studying non-human primates, we can gain traction into that question by thinking about they don't have language, and so what are they capable of in terms of number? And we can think of these, even though monkeys continued to evolve since our split from monkeys, like 30 million years ago, we can still think of this as maybe the kinds of building blocks that human evolution worked with to create our mathematical minds. So when we study monkeys with these tasks, we're not really interested in what can we train a monkey to do, what kind of artificial circus act can we engage a monkey in. We're interested in designing the experiments in ways that tap into their natural knowledge and their spontaneous numerical abilities. But because of the problem of stimulus control, meaning because we really need to understand whether it's number and not something else that the monkeys are using, we have to very carefully control all the pictures that we use, and we therefore need thousands of trials from them. So we can't just kind of show up and show the monkey. We can't give them any verbal instructions on what to do. So it does take many, many trials and months to train the monkey about what the game is, what the task is. So they learn this by trial and error. But then we have to give them new pictures once they've learned the game, give them new pictures to see whether they're really using number. And so in most of our experiments, when we show our data and really try to make conclusions about what the monkey knows, we're basing it on novel images that the monkey has never seen before, but after they've already trained up on the task so they understand what the game is all about.
You mentioned a concept that I think is very important for us to understand. It's the mathematical mind you mentioned.
Yeah.
We have only one brain, but we have different paths. Let's say language is one, and when we develop language, our brain changes. When we develop this mathematical mind, is our brain changing during life?
That's a great question, and there are a lot of laboratories that are looking at that question, seeing how the brain changes as children, for example, learn the meaning of number words. And we know a lot must be changing, right? Because symbolic mathematics and number words allow us to do so much that our primitive number sense cannot do. And yet, we find when adults or children are engaging in math questions that deeply involve the meaning of number, that this primitive number sense is engaged. And it's the brain area is called the intraparietal sulcus. It's pretty much always recruited as long as the task that a child or an adult is being faced with is actually activating the meaning of numbers. So if you're just reciting memorized multiplication tables, it might not be involved. But if you're doing calculations where you're thinking about the meaning of number, it's going to be involved. But as children learn the meaning of number words, one of the things that's happening is more communication between the hemispheres. So there are some things that are changing developmentally as children learn the meaning of number words, but the primitive number sense is there throughout the lifespan.
Yeah, I get it, and even if monkeys have it, for sure it's something that it's in our genes, right? But then it's important when we start to visualize or relate the concept of the number, like the word, or it's important if we learn at 3, 4, 5. Let me rephrase the question. It's important when we start developing this mathematical mind. Can we see some evolution or changes later? Like, let's say if I start adding up or subtraction later on my age, how will this affect my development as a person?
Right. So a young child, maybe a 2-year-old, can often recite the count list, right?
Yeah.
So you can train your 1.5 or 2-year-old to rattle off 1, 2, 3, right? But it's not until children are about 4 or 4.5 that they really show evidence on average of understanding what counting is all about and really understanding the mapping of number words onto quantities. And so, an important question is how that changes the brain as we learn symbols, because we share this primitive number sense, and yet no animal will ever develop the ability for mathematics that a child is capable of with the right input. And so we're still trying to understand these brain changes as the children learn meaning of number words. Examples of the kinds of studies that we've done is we've used both event-related potentials, where we measure brain activity from the surface of the scalp, and functional imaging to look at blood flow changes in infants and children when they're hearing number words. And we find that even when a child is just beginning to understand the meaning of number words fundamentally at 3.5, 4.5 years of age, that they're already showing ratio dependence in the neural signals when they hear these number words. So they're showing bigger brain differences, bigger brain responses to changes between, let's say, the number word 3 and 6 than the number word 3 and 4.
That's super interesting, actually. I get one question from the beginning almost of our conversation. When you mentioned it was easier for monkeys and adults and everyone to distinguish between, let's say, 5 carrots and 1 carrot, or like high ratios. But when you get like 64 and 62 things in each side, it's very hard, even for adults.
Yes.
Is there a reason why this happens? I mean, even with small numbers, maybe 60 something is huge, but 20 and 18 is hard to detect those.
So it's like a psychophysical law, Weber's law, that controls discrimination with number, and that's kind of surprising because number is a property of discrete individuals, right? It's not a continuous thing like line length or amount of stuff, and yet that's what we see. We see this ratio dependence. Now, the reason that they can't use this primitive number sense to differentiate 66 and 68 is that you need to verbally count to do that. So a human can do it if they're given the time and they verbally count. They can be 100% accurate at such a question. But if you're using your primitive number sense, even an adult would have difficulty with that kind of comparison.
And that's something I saw in your presentation. You were having a monkey pressing like images with different... that tells the difference, right, in how the primitive brain works and our developed mathematical or symbolic way function. And one way, I mean, people train for these things. There are some apps that you can get to get sharper or faster with this. How useful are these? I mean, going from neurology or neuroscience to education, that's the big step, because several years ago I remember people said, oh, if we study enough the brain, we can fine-tune things and teach educators how to improve them. Nowadays it's not that direct.
Not that easy, right?
Not that easy.
Yeah. So we're still optimistic, but it's a complicated question. So with adults, we actually had a little bit of a false start in our research program, where we initially found that we could train the approximate number system and that this would actually improve calculation abilities with symbolic math with college students. And that was a little too good to be true, and it turned out to be too good to be true. So we weren't able to replicate that whole finding. And in some ways, that's not surprising, because adults, of course, when they make calculations, we're relying on all sorts of accumulated knowledge and education, right? But you can imagine that for young children, this kind of practice with the approximate number system, the primitive number sense, could be much more important and useful before children have even learned the meaning of number words. So that's where our research is going, and other labs are looking at this too. But the idea is to use the kind of video game, like you were saying, to train up the primitive number sense and get young children, before they've even learned to count, so 3-year-olds, playing this kind of game repetitively, trying to make it fun with bells and whistles, and doing kind of approximate arithmetic, like the sort I showed in a movie of a monkey doing, of addition and subtraction. So we do these kinds of training procedures, and we have found in some cases that there are benefits in early math readiness. So we don't think it's going to be the solution at all in and of itself to improving math readiness and closing the achievement gap, for example. But we think that it might be one ingredient in an approach to early math education and improving early math readiness in our youngest children at risk for low numeracy.
Nice. I have 2 very short questions now, or one actually. Is there any difference between how males and females behave in this at the very beginning?
No, in fact, we don't see any gender differences in our youngest children. And one of my colleagues actually did a meta-analysis, collected data from all the different labs that use these looking time procedures with babies, so that she could look at a massive data set of baby data and didn't see any differences between girls and boys. And another interesting thing, girls and women show more math anxiety than boys and men later on in later childhood and adulthood. And yet, in our samples in the youngest children, we don't see any differences in anxiety or emotional effects of math. So we hope that by going in early, we can avoid this gender difference in math anxiety.
Well, that'd be great.
Yeah.
And my last question will be, the topic of this year of Congreso Futuro is, what humanity do we want to be or we want to become? What's your thought on that?
Yeah. Well, mathematics is always going to be part of humanity, and it's crucial for almost everything we do. And so I think it's crucial as we move forward in keeping our humanity and developing humanity further, that we find ways to increase early numeracy so that everyone can participate in this important aspect of human life.
That's a very good one. Thank you very much, Elizabeth Brannon.
My pleasure.
A pleasure to have you here. Muchas gracias a Elizabeth, también a todos quienes nos han estado mirando a través de la pantalla de TV Senado. Recordamos que estamos en Congreso Futuro 2025 bajo el lema ¿Qué humanidad queremos ser? Y si quieren revivir la charla de Elizabeth, lo pueden encontrar en cualquiera de las plataformas de TV Senado o también en congresofuturo.cl. Nos encontramos en una próxima edición de estas entrevistas en Congreso Futuro.